It's in many ways a really fitting way to tie together what we've been talking about for the last 2.5 days, because the right to science ties together, obviously, human rights and science. And because when the Science and Human Rights Coalition was launched 10 years ago, they chose the right to science as an umbrella initiative for the network. So it's wonderful to have you all here. What we aim to do over the course of the next hour and a half, through quite a bit of engagement with you, the audience, so be prepared, we want to go through what we have learnt about what the right to science means, what it tells us about the way we can be connecting science through the right to science with human rights, and to talk about next steps. So we want to join you, not take you on a journey, but we really want to join you on a journey on building on what we have learnt so far and considering where we should be going next as a community of individuals and organizations who are passionate about creating impact for human rights that uses science and technology. And so with that, we think about what is the nature of a coalition. It's a coalition that is bringing individuals and organizations together to achieve a common goal that they wouldn't be able to achieve individually. So the tool that we're going to be using for engagement, for any of you who don't want to be speaking out vocally, is called Mentimeter. So I ask you, for those of you who have a mobile phone, to pull it out. If you're not already connected to the AAAS Wi-Fi, and if you're on a laptop, by the way, you can use your laptop. Or tablet. Oh my. If you have a desktop, that's amazing. You can use that too. So make sure you're connected to the AAAS Wi-Fi because it'll just speed things along for you a bit. And you can see there the username and password. Connect to menti.com or go to the website menti.com and you'll be asked to put in a code. That's the code that is specific to this presentation. You can follow the presentation along on your screen if you want to, but gosh, what a boring way to follow the discussion. But we will have questions that we will be posing through Mentimeter that we'll ask you to respond to on your phone, tablet, laptop, desktop.
Or with your mouth if you prefer. Yeah.
You could, but then the answers won't appear up here.
And one of the advantages of this is that we're really collecting ideas about where the coalition will be moving forward. And so participating in this is actually really going to be helpful. It's actually a form of data collection. So we'd love it if you would participate.
And participation is taken as informed consent.
Yes, we're not publishing. It's not human rights subject research.
It is not.
It's
it
informing the work.
Oh yeah, certainly.
Okay. And on each of the questions, there will be the URL and the code. So if you miss it right now, it's okay. You'll be seeing it again.
That's right. Okay. Thank you. So we're going to start by focusing on the meaning of the right to science. Can I move from this slide now? Is that okay? Okay. So the language of the right to science was first articulated in a binding international treaty in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And you see the language of that provision here on the screen. And as I always note, it's really fascinating to me that a human rights treaty should contain so much specifically about science. So Article 15 talks about the obligation on governments to ensure that everyone enjoys the right to the benefits of scientific progress and its applications, that they conserve, develop, and diffuse science, they respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research, and recognize the benefits of international contacts and cooperation in science. For those of you who don't come from a human rights background, and may share some of the very common skepticism about international treaties, it is worth pointing out that 170 governments around the world have voluntarily said that they will be bound by the treaty and therefore by this right. Now, the color light blue indicates countries that have signed but not ratified the treaty, so that's the United States, indicating that the US, and I believe this was about 1977, but don't quote me on that. The US was indicating its intention to ratify, but clearly that has not happened, and I would proffer is not likely to happen for some time. And then in orange are the 23 countries that have not taken any action whatsoever. So we're going to start with our first Mentimeter question to help you test out the system and to help advance the conversation. Margaret.
All right. So you've heard, what's that? Yes, wonderful. Okay. So does the engagement of scientists, engineers, and health professionals help advance human rights? Based on what you've heard over the past 3 days, let us know. Is it working? Does it matter? Okay. We seem to be having a pretty solid trend line here. So I'm actually going to move on for this one because now it gets a little trickier. All right.
Do you have a microphone?
I'm sorry, is my mic not on? Okay, sorry about that. All right, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So since no one said no, I don't have to worry about the skip pattern here. So how does it help? You're saying that it makes a difference to have scientists engaged with human rights, and it helps advance human rights, but how? And you should be seeing an open-ended box. How does it help? Take a moment or two, please, and tell us. Wonderful. We're seeing insight, understanding, evidence, exposure, advocacy, tackling issues from a different perspective, providing information to support solutions. Science and health are human rights. Promoting knowledge that improves outcomes for people. Tackling issues, right, we said tackling issues from a different perspective. I mean, this is wonderful, this rich sense that science can directly contribute to human rights. So now I'd like to ask you to think about the inverse for a moment. Does the engagement of human rights practitioners help advance science? Does it make our science better? Yeah, it's very important. So we're seeing some pretty strong support for the idea. We've got 4% that are saying no, and 11%, 14% saying that they don't know. It's a more complicated question, right? What happens to the knowledge production when you're actually engaged with community actors? All right, so you probably know the next question that's coming. Here's the skip pattern. If you said yes, how does the engagement of human rights practitioners actually help advance science? Can you spend just a moment thinking about that and jotting your thoughts down? Lovely. Okay, so we're seeing some themes in terms of original questions and getting new lines of inquiry. I loved having a chance to work on the false negatives, pushing us to think about applications. The National Science Foundation talks about broader impacts, and let's think how do we actually do that? Adds a reason to tackle the questions in the first place. In broadening data inclusion and providing an alternative perspective. I mean, that gets back into really testing our validity when we start talking about triangulation of data and testing our validity. And are we studying the right questions and are our answers making sense when they're applied? Bringing in a focus on underserved communities. Wonderful, creating a demand for knowledge. I mean, right now in our society, we have this disjuncture between the understanding of the value of science and the scientific process. And what better way to help people understand the value of science, right, than to be engaging with them, and then scientists to understand how to make their work valuable. I know that this could go on for quite a while, but I hope that this process of thinking about these things have brought you a little bit right to the center of what we've been trying to do with the coalition over the past 10 years and the kinds of questions we're going to be thinking about over the next period during this presentation. So I thank you so much. We'll have more opportunities to respond in a little bit. In the meantime, back over to you, Jessica.
Thank you. Margaret gets the fun part.
I planned that well, didn't I?
So we've established why we would look at human rights and science together. And so it was that, I joined 12 years ago, and at that time I was brought on to focus on the right to science. And the only work that was really going on was an initial conversation being launched by UNESCO on what the right means. And I was at a meeting in Galway in Ireland, and around the table were medical ethicists and an awful lot of lawyers, and myself, I'm a lawyer, and talking about the right to science and what it means. And at some point in the conversation, I said, I think we really need the voices of scientists to be a part of this discussion. And these confused European lawyers looked at each other and said, well, we're scientists. There were some pretty eminent lawyers in the room, and so I didn't want to argue with them. But I did say, well, we need a broader perspective and more sciences involved in the discussion. And so the UNESCO process called for the engagement of scientists, engineers, health professionals in helping to define the right. And it was around that time that AAAS, which it doesn't do often, the board adopted a statement that recognized the right to science as lying at the heart of the AAAS mission. That's a big deal. And undertook to engage through the coalition, scientific societies in defining what the right means and bringing that understanding to the UN process. And so it was that the coalition that had recently been formed and that had chosen the right to science as an umbrella initiative began its work. And together we launched some pretty significant original research that continues to this day, and that's what you're going to be hearing about in large part. So,
I think you jumped.
I jumped. Did I jump?
I think you did. There you are.
There we go. I didn't know I could still jump. So we started with a focus group process that involved 16 disciplinary societies asking their members what the right to science means from the perspective of their discipline. We then moved, because that was very US-based, we moved to a global questionnaire for which we did not claim statistical rigor. We used a convenience sample. And we ended up with over 2,000 usable responses from around the world, from which we could discern differences and similarities in understanding of the right and the role of government in helping to support the scientific endeavor. We then worked with the support of coalition members and their students in analysing UN reports from the 170 governments to see what they're reporting on with regard to the right. that was an interesting exercise in its finding that there was lack of much consistency in the reporting. So we're not going to be focusing on the findings of that component of the research today. And then this year, we've been working with partners to do research with senior and young academies on the right to science. We fielded a questionnaire, and we got fielded a questionnaire to 128 senior academies in countries that are a party to the covenant and 44 young academies, and we got 92 responses. So that's over 50% response rate. And then we conducted interviews with individual representatives of 14 of those academies to dig deeper into what we'd learned from the questionnaire. So these are some of our findings in brief. We could spend much longer, but we're going to give you the snapshots. This keeps jumping. Odd. So first, what have been the primary findings and contributions of the work that we've done? Through our work, we've been able to identify what scientists understand to be the top 10 benefits of science to society. We developed a conceptualization of access with regard to science, which we've called the Continuum of Access, and I will describe. And we identified, through the scientists that we've engaged in this process, the tools and mechanisms needed to support access. We've looked comparatively at the global perspective on the issue, and we also dove specifically into the work of global public health practitioners to understand how useful or not might be using the tool of the right to science in their work. So in terms of the top 10 benefits, and I was really interested to see some of your responses to the original questions about the value of science and human rights. So when you see the top 10, health came out across most of the focus groups with which we engaged. And the disciplines we engaged ranged from mechanical engineering to chemistry, sociology, psychology, and so forth. But there was a general agreement that health in its many forms was a major benefit of science. So there we're looking at products and services. But very soon the discussion got into science and the knowledge that it generates and the data and findings that you can generate through science as being benefits themselves. And I think that was reflected in some of the responses that you gave to the Mentimeter questions. And then we get to this continuum of access. So in some of the preliminary United Nations work on this right, there was an understanding that when you think about access to science, you have to think about science as a whole. It's not just about the products and services of science. It's about everything that leads to their development and other major benefits of the enterprise overall. And so here we have, at one end of this continuum, the general public. And all of us, no matter your disciplinary expertise or level of authority in your field, at different points are members of the general public. And so we use, for example, a heart surgeon who's wanting to understand whether there are tablets and mobile phones and how to use them and so forth, maybe just a member of the public where their expertise is not necessarily informing their access and their knowledge. But then as we move along the continuum, through motivation, through interest, through training, through education, access becomes riskier. And we need greater access in order to exercise our commitment and work in the area of science. And so there you see scientists at the end of the continuum. And then we have the tools and mechanisms needed to support access. And it's probably not surprising to you that most of the scientists in our focus groups and through the global questionnaire mentioned funding. They also mentioned education and training, that being, of course, at all levels, K through 12 as well as university, and it also not necessarily requiring everybody to have formal education in science, but sufficient education in science to be able to make informed personal choices. And then access to information communication technologies these days, as we heard in the closing session yesterday, is a basic human right, and it facilitates and ensures the ability to engage in science, to learn from science, to participate, and so forth. So they were two major contributions that we have made to the discussion about the right to science that we have seen since integrated into and informing UN discussions on the right, as well as general scholarship and deliberation. Then we had our global questionnaire. So we wanted to ask, to what extent are the views of scientists, engineers, and health professionals similar or different based on region with regard to the benefits of the right and also government actions required to support it? So these are just some of the top level findings, and I should say all of our reports on this work are available freely online. So the top 5 government actions to support the respondents' work. Again, number 1 was funding. Number 2 was education. Number 3, now this was conducted in 2016-2017 to promote a positive view of science and scientists among the public, ensure open access to scientific information, and promote and protect academic freedom. There were several interesting differences that we saw across regions, that we saw across disciplines, that we saw across sectors. I've pulled out just 2. For those in industry and the commercial sector, reforming intellectual property laws and promoting technology transfer were of higher priority than for scientists outside that sector. And also, respondents in the Global South were the most likely to select technology transfer as an action required by government to support their work. And then we had these fascinating interviews conducted with global health practitioners. These are individuals who, it's easy to argue, are supporting the right to health and the right to science, and often quite effectively including the World Trade Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the World Health Organization, and at national levels. But they're not explicitly using human rights language, and certainly not the right to science. And so we wanted to understand from them what might be the value of using the right to science framework. So for some, there was value in using the human rights framework generally, but they also saw many limitations. And I think this is important. It's probably not new to many of you, but it's important when we think strategically about how we use human rights, what our goals are, and how we should be, in many contexts, thinking incrementally about how to create greater comfort around the notion of human rights, rather than leading always with the language of human rights. And then they identified areas in which the right to science is particularly relevant in a global health context. So with that, I will turn it to Margret.
Lovely. All right, so as we've been thinking about this project of the coalition, and you all have been hearing about the prior work that we've been doing, we are really trying to move from science, right? And science and scientists come with their own epistemological frame, their own normative structures, their own ideas of incremental accretion of knowledge. There's a very distinct culture and set of norms and ontological and epistemological perspectives within science. In this conference in particular, I think it's been incredibly exciting to have heard so much from human rights practitioners and learning more about the pursuit of human rights on the ground, where you again have a particular normative framework for advocacy, for speaking truth to power, for rapid response. And how one of our challenges as we think about coalition is how do we bring these two groups together? You all are all absolutely convinced the value of this. I mean, our first sense that science, the first question about science contributing to human rights, you were all quite sure that that's without a doubt making a difference, and many of you felt like the relationship going in the other direction was actually quite valuable as well. But how do we overcome these differences? And one of the things that we've been really intrigued by in the right to science, Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, is the way in which that international treaty, that aspect of an international treaty, could actually serve as a bridge, as something that might bring these disparate communities together. And could that really happen? So one of the challenges is you start trying to think about that in terms of how could we bring them together so that they were working as a coherent whole. As a sociologist, I inevitably start thinking about structural solutions. What can we do to engage? Who are the social actors that would help us create that bridge to span the distance? One of the things that came out as we were doing the global questionnaire, in particular, was that there were some very important regional differences around the world in how scientists viewed the right to science and where were the most important applications. So, and we have an idea enshrined within the UN and the rights framework of incremental fulfillment of rights and paying attention to the actual grounded situational context for different nations as they are working to fulfill rights. So who could help bring science and human rights actors together in Article 15, in the right to science, in a way that would be cognizant of the specific situation on the ground in different nation states, in different states party to the treaty, that would understand where are the most important places to start working on fulfillment. This was a sort of central question. Where do you find the lever? And so the question arose in our minds about whether national academies of science could actually be a pivotal actor in this process of trying to bridge from scientists and human rights practitioners through Article 15. Could national academies play that role? And that's really the question that motivated the fourth data collection project that we've been engaged with, that Jessica mentioned briefly as she was going over all four of these. Okay, so we indeed sent out a survey to the national academies, both senior academies and young academies, in all of the countries that have ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So we sent out 172 surveys. We got 128 responses from senior academies, 44 from young academies. I'm sorry, senior academies are generally academies that have been around for a long time. They tend to be more recognized by their governments. They tend to be established over long periods of time. Young academies generally have a much less formal infrastructure. They generally have a different process. They're working to bring in the voices of younger scientists that are really engaged and actively involved, but may not yet be recognized, have reached the level of stature in their field that they're going to end up being invited to be members of the senior academies. Would you like to add anything to that, Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, the National Academies of the United States are senior academies. There is an organization, the Global Young Academies, that bring together these academies, as Margaret said, which are really focused on younger scientists. So whereas the senior academies are recognizing individuals who over a long career have contributed mightily in their field and so forth, the young academies really is about supporting people early in their career. And so it's quite a different demographic and focus.
Teresa, did we do okay on that? All right, wonderful. One of our collaborators from the Inter-Academy Partnership, so who's been essential to this process. Okay, so in some ways in our response rates, you can see a reflection of this distinction. Among the senior academies, we had a 59% response rate to the survey, and among the young academies, we had a 36% response rate. And I see that as reflective of the fact that the senior academies have more institutionalization. They have more staff that are around to answer, emails that come in, where in many cases the younger academies don't have that. The last question on our very brief survey was, would you be willing to participate in a follow-up interview? And we got a really remarkable number of folks who said yes, they would like to participate in an interview. We had limited person power for conducting those interviews, so we only conducted 14 of them. We were able to talk to 63% of the people that we invited to participate in a follow-up interview from the senior academies, and all of the people that we invited from the young academies agreed to participate. So, this level of data analysis is still very preliminary, and so I'm going to be sharing with you 3 findings that seem to be emerging from this data, but are not yet fully fleshed out. So you're getting the sort of hot off the press, let's see if it works. And also, I'm interested in your thoughts on this as you're hearing this and you have your own experiences. You may have ideas. Let us know what your thoughts are. We'll be sharing our emails at the end. There may be some time for open-ended Q&A about whether these findings resonate for you all. So the first finding, which was really quite interesting to me, is that the right to science is both little known and perceived by many of the actors within these national academies as core to their mission, which I think is quite fascinating, that you can throw out an idea to someone who has really never heard of it before. So, is it going to work? Come on now. There we are. 56% of our survey respondents had not heard of the right to science prior to receiving the questionnaire, right? Even though they worked in National Academies of Science. Now, some of them are science and technology, some of them are science, technology, and social sciences, some of them even have the humanities in them. There are all sorts of different constellations. So we tend to say National Academies rather than National Academies of Science to take into account that broader range. But so they hadn't heard of it. More than half of them had never heard of it. Now, we asked them about what they saw as their influence on government policy. And I should say that 95% of them said that they saw as part of their mission influencing government policy, right? But they, on a scale of 1 to 4, in terms of how much influence they really felt they had, they were coming in at 2.3, 2.4, right? They weren't super, super optimistic about the kind of influence that they were having. But when we asked them about how likely they were to be able to influence the fulfillment of the right to science, did they see themselves as really being able to have a role there? They ranked themselves, again on that scale of 1 to 4, it looks like considerably higher. I still have to go back and do more analysis to make sure that that's actually a statistically significant finding, but I think it's interesting, and it brings out this idea that although the right to science was a little known, it was perceived as really being core to their mission, and they thought, wow, we might be able to do something here. So this is just a quote from some notes. We took all the interviewers took notes as they were doing these interviews. And one interviewer wrote, she indicated that she has thought about scientific advancement almost as a privilege, but would like to learn about the notion of science as a right. She mentioned that there's something powerful about this idea, right? Now this was from someone at a young academy, right? But we got similar thoughts. Oh, I should go back one. Hang on. I don't have this one on a slide, but I want to share it with you. This is from someone from a national academy that I believe has been in existence for about 130 years, right? So the first one had been in existence for maybe 10. Okay. This is someone who's been, their academy has been in existence for more than a century. I think in many respects, the academies are ideally placed to work on the fulfillment of the right to science for 2 reasons. One is that most academies see themselves as offering policy advice to a range of role players who may in the first instance be legislators of some kind, but may also be the general public or business or whatever. I think academies, by the reports they produce, have the opportunity to influence people in these matters and to influence them to think of having a right to science. Second aspect of it is that individual members of academies have expertise and can use that expertise to highlight these issues and make them more available to the broader public. So it seems like there's potential in this idea of national academies playing a key role. But it's not all that simple. It seems good, but there's some real caveats. So one is that government relations are a key concern among the academies. Now, as I mentioned, 95% of our respondents said that informing government policy, informing policy at the national level, was something that they saw as central to their mission. Okay. But the lines of communication with the government actors were often described as missing and in some cases openly hostile. And without robust lines of communication and a sense of shared purpose, the ability of national academies to meaningfully inform government policy is inevitably curtailed. So this was, again, from some notes in one of the interviews. This academy was established within the past 15 years. They are not currently funded by the government. It has been quite an uphill battle to get to the government, said the respondent. Okay, so this, the respondents also discussed political constraints on activities of academies related to both civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. When speaking out on behalf of persecuted scientists, respondents mentioned feeling pressure from the government to not upset relationships with offending countries by speaking out on human rights issues. Another respondent mentioned receiving considerable pressure from the government because the Academy's recommendations regarding a major international development project were in contradiction to the government's agenda for that project. Okay, so someone else put a frame on this and spoke about it in a more umbrella sense and saying that the main issue is that scientists and politicians speak different languages, making it difficult to understand each other. This is a major problem worldwide. So the implications of this, as we think about this contentious relationship or challenging relationship between national academies and the government, one point to think about is that the right to science is articulated in international treaty documents that bind nation states. The right to science implies specific states' party obligations, and the United Nations system of periodic reporting calls for states party to account for their efforts toward the fulfillment of the right to science. So clearly, having a positive relationship between national academies and governments would be essential for these two parties to be able to work toward the fulfillment of the right. But it could be that if national academies initiated new activities that were framed explicitly in terms of the right to science, and they provided an overview or a compilation of states' actions in terms of the right to science, in a way that could inform and assist states party in their periodic reporting, that rather than seeing the national academies, any engagement by the national academies in human rights as being at crosshairs to the goals of the states party, they could be seen as collaborators, that this could actually provide a point of common interest between them. And so there's some potential there in that. All right, so the third finding is that partners and collaboration are essential. When we talk to the national academies about their work, and what they were doing, they described working with many different organizations. They spoke of collaborations with entities within their own countries, including government departments of science and technology, government ministries, national museums, foreign offices and embassies. They also talked about collaborating with other academies in their own countries. There was a lot of discussion about the collaboration between senior and young academies. One respondent talked about it as a symbiotic relationship. They also talked about partnerships with umbrella organizations, including the Global Young Academy, the International Human Rights Network, the Inter-Academy Partnership, Interaction Council, Scholars at Risk, and of course the United Nations and UNESCO. The general view was that academies were more likely to produce results when working on human rights issues in collaboration. I loved this comment. This was from a respondent at a medium-sized and relatively recently formed academy. Anytime we do something great, it's because we've engaged with others. A respondent from a large academy that has existed, again, for more than 100 years, said, it's best for the impact of the work to not do it by yourself as one academy, but to do it as a group of academies. So it seems clear that building on this existing pattern of collaborative engagement on human rights issues would be an appropriate approach for any effort to engage the academies. But what we have to figure out is how we can help academies do that while also being cognizant of the fact that each academy is going to need to work with the right to science in the context of their own specific national challenges, structures on the ground, and what they're doing with to figure out what is the most appropriate and actionable points of engagement in that national context. All right. So, fine. The last thing that I want to talk to you all about, okay. Maybe that's actually readable. I was sort of hoping so. This is the last findings graphic I want to share with you all, and it's a little bit complex, although what it's doing is actually very simple. In the survey, we asked all the national academies to indicate which of 8 specific activities they had engaged with over the past 3 years. And the activities were science education, healthcare, climate change, sustainable development, emerging technologies, ethics, and scientific freedom. Now, having spent the last 3 days here, you all probably immediately recognize these as things that are related to the right to science. But we didn't frame them that way in the survey. We just said, have you done any of these things? So in the analysis, we looked at, by region, which of these activities were the most likely to be mentioned as an activity in which they engaged. And I was interested in the top 3 in each region. Now, sometimes different academies, or pardon me, the top or the second or the third most frequently mentioned activity, there was actually a tie in terms of the averages on them being mentioned. So the dark bar at the very top here are the most frequently mentioned, but in North America, there were 3 specific activities that were equally frequently mentioned. All right? Now, the bars go across when they're defining cross-cutting activities, things that academies across the regions were interested in. So we see there's some regional variation, but I think that one of the most exciting things is that we see some really fascinating overlaps. So we can see that science education, right, goes right across the regions, and if you include the second most frequently mentioned ones, science education goes right across all of the regions that were examined, right? If you look at sustainable development, right, across all the regions, it was the second most frequently mentioned activity. Now, I realize that there's an endogeneity here because, sustainable development, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Of course the academies are going to be working on this. I'm not trying to say that this is that this is coming solely from the academies. But what it does do is it says if we're going to work on a project with national academies to try and get them to be thinking about the right to science and engaging in the right to science, we've got two themes that are going to immediately resonate with science education and sustainable development. So we now have an entree point for thinking about this. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica to talk some more about next steps.
This is going to be brief, and just to say that these are our preliminary thoughts. As Margaret said, we're still completing the analysis of what we've most recently done in the research. But given the findings that seem to be emerging, here are some ideas for what we may do. There's clearly both a lack of knowledge about the right to science within academies, but a real interest in learning more because it's seen as so connected to their work and missions. And so we may want to, and if there is interest obviously in the academies, provide training on the right to science, and because these are academies that by definition are in countries that have ratified the covenant, train them in what the opportunities may be to engage at the UN level on the implementation of the right to science within their country context. We could potentially work with academies that are interested in developing one of these periodic reports that Margaret mentioned to go to the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Now, we don't suggest this because the submission of the report itself is what is likely to have the most value, although it would have some, you would hope, but rather the process of working domestically with all of the relevant stakeholders, communities, and so forth in articulating the experience of the right to science in that country, that process in itself would have a lot of value. And then we could work with those academies potentially to help them identify how to develop such a process and how to bring the outcomes to the UN and support the preparation of the report. Now, obviously, this is something that we would want to do collectively through the coalition, recognizing that the associations and individuals who form the Science and Human Rights Coalition have connections with colleagues with other disciplinary groups in each of these relevant countries as well. So there are preliminary thoughts, and we can certainly develop them further. So we're going to now re-engage you on a key question that we come to at the end of this conference. And we came to this question and formulated it this way because what we've seen through this conference is there is such a wealth and richness of fabulous work going on at the intersections of science, technology, and human rights, being led by individuals, being led by organizations, being supported by funders. It's happening, however, at an ad hoc level. When somebody asked there was a panel, and I don't recall now which one, how did you two connect? How did the community group connect with the scientists? And it was fortuitous. How then do we make this go from being ad hoc to institutionalizing this as a practice? So that's the impetus for this question. I'll turn to you, Margaret.
Okay. So we're going to ask you all to really think about this through a process that some of you may be familiar with, which is a write, pair, share activity. So I'm going to ask you all to either use your device or pull out a piece of paper and spend 2 minutes thinking about this question that Jessica has posed to us. How do we take this process of connecting scientists and human rights practitioners out of the range of ad hoc, and what could we actually do to institutionalize that, to make that a regular thing so people knew how to make that happen? So if you'll take 2 minutes and write on your own, jot down your ideas, then I'm going to ask you, if you're sitting by yourself, maybe to move so you can get nearer somebody else. and then share those ideas with someone else, and maybe provide some feedback to each other. Oh, this, why don't you add this, or here's another idea. And then we're going to use Mentimeter to give you all a chance to report back on the results of those. Okay, so we're going to start off. I'm going to say, let's say 2 minutes. 2 minutes actually is a relatively long period of time. And you'll hear a bell, and then, or a chime. And then I'm going to ask you to find somebody else to sit and talk to about that, probably for about 5 minutes. Okay, so let's get started. Put some thought into it. How could we solve this? How could we institutionalize the connections between science, technology, and human rights? Oh, it stopped. Okay, so let's stop that part now. And I'm going to invite you. And it's interesting to see, you all looked at me kind of askance. 2 minutes of silence can sound like a long time, and you were like, wait, this is not what's supposed to happen, right? Okay, but now I'm going to ask you to do something even more outrageous and boundary breaking. I'm going to ask you to find someone or move so you're near someone and talk to each other for 5 minutes. And if it's a group of 3, that's fine. But groups of 2 or groups of 3, and talk to each other about what you wrote down. Okay. Thank you all for these conversations. It's an amazing thing to see the kind of energy that happens when people who have been thinking about these ideas over 3 days have a chance to come together and talk with each other. But I'm going to ask you to go ahead and draw your conversations to a close for now. Thank you so much. I know once you get people started on this topic, it's really hard to stop. And you all can also, hopefully you still have some cards left. If these conversations are so interesting, and they are, I mean, the energy, it's really exciting to be up here and watch what happened, right? Where, again, you all look at me like askance, and then the volume in the room kept on going up as people got more and more engaged and more excited about the conversations that were happening. So pass your cards out and, be able to follow up on them. But for right now, what I'd like to ask you to do is actually go back to Mentimeter and see if you can capture some of what was going on in your conversation in the open-ended responses in Mentimeter. And let's give ourselves a chance to see what the other groups were saying. So if you'll just take a couple of minutes and see if you can capture some of that. We're seeing some. Okay, young scientists need to have transdisciplinary training and understanding. Promote the AAAS Coalition as a convening body and expand with more members. Yes, please go back to your associations if you all aren't already members of the coalition, and join. Oh, there it is, my favorite. Increase the valuation of these collaborations through change in tenure practices and the requirements for promotion. Yeah, wow, we get lots of comments on lots we should have an audio recorder on as well, so we could have captured that. Science and human rights incubators to bring together these ideas. Wow, that sounds like a National Science Foundation grant. Right, wonderful. Yes, and there we go. Provide incentives via funding and other rewards. Work with accrediting organizations. Do you want to pick one out here that jumps out at you?
Incorporate work on the right to science in hiring, tenure and promotion. That one you've done already. Providing incentives. Demanding human rights formation in science faculties.
Nice.
Inform the public about the right to science. Allocate resources for research. Use faith-based communities as a communal space for bringing these communities together. All right. There's somebody saying about national academies, they have power and resources and believe that connecting science and human rights is already central to their mission. So let's really
Dive in there.
Rejoining programs and efforts at UNESCO and other international organizations.
Indigenous and marginalized communities must be part of the conversation from the beginning. Yeah, such an important point. All right. Well, that's quite exciting. I think at this point, I really want to thank you all for participating in that activity. And I hope that it's given you a chance to think about this and maybe think about what you might do. Like we've been talking about the coalition, and we've been talking about this at a sort of more meta level. And so I'd like to go ahead and ask you all one more question. Oh, there it is again. Okay. So, when you go back to your organization, what is one thing that you will do to help institutionalize the connections between science, technology, and human rights? Whether your organization is a human rights organization, or an academic institution, or a scientific organization, what could you do when you get home, when you get back to work on Monday, to help institutionalize the connections between science, technology, and human rights? And would you take a moment to respond? Here we go. Thank you all. Wonderful. I'm just going to give it a moment longer because people are still typing. This is... Okay.
What I like about this is, first of all, it's a personal commitment, and although some of them seem ambitious, they seem to be coming from people who've already started down a path towards that ambitious goal. And so the fact that you've already started indicates there's a commitment and you know what you're doing.
Did you notice the one about continuing to monitor the minor in human rights that was connecting human rights and engineering?
Yes.
I was like, wow, that's really exciting that that's happening.
And then there's also a lot of sharing going on, or that is going to go on. And one of the great benefits of sharing is that we broaden our community. We broaden the understanding that there is this community of individuals and organizations who are already doing work and are committed. We can bring others into the fold, and together we can learn and do better and do more. I'm somewhat embarrassed now to put together a list. We didn't know what you were going to come up with. So we had some thoughts that are in no way comprehensive for everything from bite-sized pieces to much larger activities that people might think about engaging in. Bite-size. Sign up for the AAAS Science and Human Rights Report. Learn about what others are doing in this area. Find out what the most recent literature is at the intersection of science, technology, and human rights. Sharing. Many of you have already committed to sharing resources, conversations with colleagues. Build relationships with vulnerable and marginalized local communities. That I see as one such key step, and it was reflected, we don't mention specifically Indigenous, but it was reflected in a couple of the comments we've made. So much of what the scientific community needs is to understand the needs of those on the ground. And it's only through building relationships and through relationships of trust that we're really going to be able to understand what is needed and how a relationship might work. Assess how effectively you're integrating human rights into your work or your institution is doing so in theirs. Organize a discussion group in your institution to connect science, technology, and human rights. If you're a student or if you're a teacher, if you're on a campus, we have a campus toolkit that has multiple videos that are discussion starters. We have suggested discussion topics to facilitate these conversations on campus, but they could easily be applied elsewhere. Integrate human rights principles and approaches into training and standards for scientists, so training, the education, standards, ethics, codes of conduct. Teach the value of scientific methods and tools for human rights to science majors so that they understand the broad applicability of what they're learning. Teach through experiential learning effective methods for collaboration. It's not simply about one and another and they come together and all works. No. Collaboration requires, like all relationships, requires an awful lot more work and understanding than that. So these are preliminary thoughts, and you've added to and made this list even richer. And I was just thinking about this and the work that we do and what's effective in terms of we need to connect more effectively, we need to learn from each other, then we need to act, and we have to be aiming for impact. And so think about where across those four you're engaging. All of them are important, but ultimately we are certainly aiming for positive impact. So with that, I want to acknowledge all the many people who have been involved in our work on the right to science over the years. There are several of you in the auditorium now. As you can see from this list, there are several who are not. But this work has only been made possible by many individuals and the organizations they represent and with whom we've worked. There are a lot of resources available about the right to science, both our own publications and others. Through this website, I encourage you to go to that if you're interested in learning more. And you're certainly very welcome to contact Margret or myself to learn more about the work that we do, to become engaged in the work that we do. We love collaborations, as that list of acknowledgements hopefully demonstrates. So with that, we have a small amount of time for questions and comments from the audience. You don't have to send them through Mentimeter. In fact, I don't think we set up that opportunity. So please use the microphones in the aisles. Thank you.
Sure.
I know you've already spoken a lot more in this session than you anticipated doing.
Since nobody is taking the opportunity, I'm just going to do it.
Thank you.
My name is Nitaya Sanbut. So I came to this session very enthusiastic. I was very like, oh, being part of, this whole conference made me like, oh, I want to learn more. But throughout the presentation, I got really concerned. And I would like to share my concerns so that, because I know you've been doing this work for so long that you can't possibly explain everything. So I hope my concerns will, lead you to explain to more of what you do that would reduce my concern. So it's not a challenge, it's just like, hoping we can talk more about it. So I think, as I look at through your graph from, something that caught my eyes was the access to samples, materials, and subjects, right? So I would like to hear more about the responsibility of scientists, because the rights of people who are living in a place where those samples, where those materials, where those subjects would be collected. So we talk about access to those things, but what are the responsibilities of those who's trying to access it, and how can we respect the rights of the communities? For example, indigenous peoples have their community protocol. How are we not, crashing with that? And so basically, yeah, we want to look at more the protectors of those subjects, right? And I also kind of want to understand more how is this not then become typical knowledge extraction. So that's something that I'm very concerned that I would like to hear more. And when we are talking about how can we bridge science and human rights, right? I want to, I don't know if we don't engage people who have been historically marginalized and whose rights have been violated for so long in the conversation. I mean, maybe part of your surveys, but just from the presentation, I don't see a lot of that. And I mean, the work started from the US-based communities, and then even expanding outside the US is still, through digital surveys, right? So whose voices are being excluded in that process? So that's just something that I think, it would be more to for me to learn. And yeah, so just thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I'll grapple with the first if you want to build on that, and then we'll take the second. So in my description of the continuum of access, I mentioned that there are various ways that you can move along the continuum, but that in moving along the continuum, the risks increase. And as you say, also therefore the responsibilities. One thing that we picked up on really early in looking at the language of this right, it's framed very positively. It talks about the obligation on governments to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research. Nowhere does it talk about responsibilities. And so as a result, what we did in parallel, and that's a very large ongoing piece of research that we're doing at the moment, is that we similarly, because we're a scientific organization, we've engaged scientists and engineers globally in a global survey. Now this is NSF funded, it is a rigorous, statistically rigorous survey, in trying to understand what they believe are their social responsibilities as scientists, getting to some of the questions that you were asking, and using what we find from that to then complement what we're finding about the positives of the right to science. I'm going to, when I make my closing remarks, put up a slide of a statement that AAAS adopted on scientific freedom and scientific responsibility that identifies the two as being inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. But the problem is we haven't got very far in our conversation about what the social responsibilities of scientists are. There's a lot of viewpoints, but there's little coalescence around key principles. And so recognizing that that's a fault in the text of the UN treaty and in the way a lot of that discussion unfolds, we want to help fill that gap. So that's the first, in response to your first question, but Margaret, what do you want to add?
Well, I first want to say thank you for your question. It is such a core, important question, and the way you framed the question is going to inform how we present this work moving forward. So I really appreciate you being willing to frame it and frame it in such a fundamental way. The pieces that I would like to add to this, I mean, you're talking about something that is vitally important. And while we have done some things that do in fact respond to the issues that you're raising. I don't want to suggest, as I do bring some of those forward and some of those aspects of the international treaty language forward, I don't want to imply that I'm saying that therefore it's not a problem, because it is a problem, right? So let me, sort of having said those two things. One of the things that I think is very interesting that has come out in some of the prior work on the right to science is that people have a right to be protected from the misuse of science, which Jessica had just alluded to. And we have a great deal of evidence of the misuse of science in relationship with Indigenous communities. And so with Indigenous communities being the subjects of scientific research in ways that were deleterious to their health and well-being, in terms of knowledge extraction, without any repayment for the knowledge that is in those communities. One of the things that I think is interesting that has come out of some of the work on the right, and that also does show up in the Continuum, is that the right to science implies the right to the participation in science, not just to be able to use the science, or to benefit from a product of science, but to be engaged in the process itself. And if that's true, then it says that Indigenous peoples and local communities have a right to be involved, right? And it goes back to that question that we were asking about how does engagement with human rights practitioners help the science, right? And I think that we need to get better at articulating the ways that it does and why it's absolutely essential, right? So, so for the moment, that's all I can say, except for, again, to reiterate, thank you for the challenge.
And your second question was about the absence of many voices and key voices in the work that we've done. And that is a discussion that has arisen before in forums just like this when we're talking about the work that we've done. We started where we did because of who we are. We're scientific organizations. And so it made sense for us to begin with what does the scientific community understand to be this right and how it relates to their work. But we absolutely recognize that that is one piece. It is not the only piece. It should not necessarily be the primary piece in defining what this right means. There have been discussions at the UN that have involved many others who are approaching this question from other perspectives. And I think what we need to look at is the extent to which they're doing that effectively, where the gaps are, and so how we can help support and complement that work. But I absolutely agree. This is one piece of the puzzle. It's an important piece, but there are others, as you so rightly pointed out, that have to be part of this conversation. And so the question is, what's the best group? Who's the best individual to do that? But it needs to be done. We're at time. But I don't want to truncate the conversation unnecessarily if others have questions they would like. I know it's been a very full 3 days. Well, I don't want to stand in the way of you and taking a mental break to absorb all of this, so I will thank Margret very much for collaborating with me in this project and for your words in this session.